John Travolta, a Golden Globe winner, more than 4 decades standing firm under lights that never turn off. A living icon who has redefined the way a star can exist between glory and the silences no one sees in Hollywood. From the fiery dance steps of Saturday Night Fever to the undeniable charm of Grease, then the cool and unexpected return in Pulp Fiction, he has conquered the brightest stages on the planet with natural charisma, performing instinct, and an almost instinctive belief that the lights would never leave him. Millions look at John Travolta as a symbol of success, of perseverance, of a real American dream where talent and opportunity meet to create a life that everyone wants to have. But behind that glory is a story that is not glamorous but heavier than anything people have ever imagined. A first love that ended in illness and death, leaving a gap that no role could fill. The years falling from the peak when the phone no longer rang and the invitations gradually disappeared, when he had to face the truth that the lights could go out at any time. A man standing in the middle of his own life, not knowing where he belonged anymore, between fame and oblivion, between glorious memories and long silent days. The loss of his son whom he had tried to protect with everything he had, a moment with no explanation, no second chance, only the heavy silence stretching on afterward. And then once again, losing the woman who had been by his side through the darkest years, the one who had helped him stand up when everything collapsed, leaving a gap that no one could replace. The memories did not disappear. The silences could not be filled. The pains never truly left, but only learned to hide behind a familiar smile. And now at the age of 72, when the lights are no longer bright enough to hide everything, when time is no longer as open as before, when each passing day carries a fragile feeling he cannot deny, what is really happening with John Travolta in the shadows of fame and the memories that have never rested, and whether the smile the world has believed for many decades is only the last way he holds on to what he cannot lose anymore. Before we step deeper into this story, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to respect the man who has lost so much but has never left life behind. Right from when he was still a child, John Travolta did not grow up in the quiet like many others, but in a space always full of sound voices, laughter, music, and lines echoing from the long acting rehearsals in the small house where his mother, a woman carrying a strong belief in the arts, devoted almost her entire life to pursuing and passing that passion on to her children. In that house, the stage was not a distant place, but a part of daily life, present in every corner of the room, in every story, in the way people looked at each other and talked to each other, as if real life was also just a play with no ending. But the very place where others might see opportunity was where a child began to feel pressure he could not yet name. Because from very early on, he understood that he was not simply living, but had to become something, someone. A version good enough to be seen, to be recognized, to be accepted in a world where attention always seemed conditional. No one said it directly to him. There was no specific demand, but it existed in the way eyes turned toward the stage, in the quiet expectation every time he stood up to perform, in the moments when the silence after a performance was more frightening than criticism, because silence meant no one really saw him. And gradually, something began to form inside. Not talent, not ambition, but a deep need. The need to be recognized, to be listened to exist in the eyes of others, as if without that gaze, he would disappear. There were children who grew up with the freedom to make mistakes, to be silent, to not have to become anyone. But for him, every moment seemed to carry an invisible demand, to do better, to express more clearly, to prove that he deserved to be here, deserved the artistic space he was born into. And the most heartbreaking thing was not that the pressure existed, but that it came too early, when he was still just a child who had not yet understood the world, had not yet understood himself, but had already begun to learn how to adjust emotions, how to control expressions, how to hide the weak parts to fit what others expected. In a house where everyone had a voice, had a role, had a way to be noticed. He gradually became the one who had to try harder to be heard, as if his voice was always a little lower, always needed to be louder, clearer, stronger to reach someone. And over time, that effort was no longer a choice, but became instinct, a reflex he carried into every space afterward, from the stage, the film set, to personal relationships. He learned to smile even when he was not sure he was really okay. Learned to say exactly what others wanted to hear. Learned to become the version the world would accept most easily. Because deep inside, there was always the fear that if he stopped, if he no longer performed, if he no longer made others pay attention, then the silence would return. And this time, it would swallow him completely. That was not a great, loud, dramatic fear, but a quiet, long fear, weaving through the years, shaping the way he viewed himself and the world around him, making him always feel he needed to do more, give more, become more, just to make sure he was not forgotten. And perhaps, right from those first years, before the stage lights truly shone on his life, before fame came and turned him into a symbol, something had quietly been shaped. That love, attention, and his existence in the eyes of others had never been something taken for granted, but always something he had to work to hold on to, little by little, in a world where even when it was full of sound, he had never really felt he was being listened to. And then, in the years when John Travolta was still trying to figure out who he was, in a world that always demanded he become someone, he met Diana Hyland, a woman unlike anyone he had ever known. Someone who did not look at him as a role, did not judge him by the way he performed, did not expect him to become a more perfect version, but simply saw him the real person, with all the silences, the insecurities, and the things he had never dared to say. In that first time, he did not need to try to impress, did not need to prove his worth, did not need to be bigger, stronger, or more standout, because beside her, he was enough, a feeling both strange and gentle to the point that he almost could not believe it was real. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be listened to, not with the ears, but through the presence of another person who did not try to change him, did not require him to become anything other than himself. The days together passed without noise, without drama, without highs or lows, but only small, ordinary moments that could easily be overlooked, long conversations, looks that needed no explanation, silences that were no longer frightening because someone was sharing them. In the middle of a life always full of pressure, where every step could be judged, those moments became the only place he could relax, where he did not need to perform, did not need to become anyone other than his true self. But life, it seemed, had never let him keep the important things for too long, and this time was no different. When the illness appeared, it did not come like a storm, but quietly crept into each day, each week, each moment. At first, small signs that could be overlooked, then gradually becoming clearer, heavier, undeniable. He saw the change, not immediately, but little by little, as if life was being taken away piece by piece, slowly but unstoppable. There was no way to prepare for that. No words enough to explain, no action that could reverse what was happening. He was there beside her, not as a star, not as a strong man, but just as a person trying to hold on to the only thing that made him feel not alone, even knowing it was slipping away from his hands. There were moments when he could only sit quietly, watch, and wait, hoping for something he himself could not name, because hope sometimes was not belief in a result, but the only way to keep breathing when everything was gradually disappearing. And then, when the final moment came, it was not loud, had no climax, had no clear sign that this was the ending, only another silence, but this time deeper, heavier, irreversible. He was there, watching the person he loved leave, unable to do anything to keep her, unable to negotiate with time, unable to change anything, and for the first time in his life, he understood a truth that would follow him for the rest of the journey, that there are losses that do not come from not trying hard enough, but simply because you have no right to keep them. That pain did not disappear after that day, did not end with one moment, but stayed, quietly, weaving into the way he viewed the world, the way he loved, the way he trusted, and the way he feared. Love, from then on, was no longer an absolutely safe place, but something fragile, breakable, always carrying the possibility of disappearing at any time. And even though he continued to live, continued to move forward, continued to build new relationships, deep inside, there was always the memory of the first time he truly loved, and the first time he had to learn to let go, not because he wanted to, but because there was no other choice, as if life had quietly taught him a lesson he had never been ready to learn. That sometimes the most painful thing is not losing, but realizing that no matter how much you love, no matter how hard you try, there are things you cannot keep. And after experiencing that first loss he could not prepare for, John Travolta did not have much time to pause or truly understand what had just happened, because life, in a way, had pushed him forward at a speed he himself could not control. And then success came, not in slow, careful steps, but like a huge wave that swept away everything still unfinished inside him. When Saturday Night Fever came out in 2015, he was not just an actor anymore, but became the image representing an entire generation, a symbol of music, of movement, of a time when everything seemed brighter, faster, more alive. And right after that, Grease continued to lift him to a place very few people could reach, where his name was no longer just an individual but a part of pop culture. An image repeated on screens, on the radio, on every street corner where people talked about the American dream. But what no one saw was that all of that happened while he still had not had time to become a complete man. While the questions about himself, about emotions, about loss, still had no answers. While the wounds from the past were still there, not yet healed, not yet understood, and he was already placed in a position where every eye was on him. Every expectation weighed heavily on every step he took. Fame came faster than his ability to understand and control it, and while the whole world saw a confident, charming man who always knew how to own the stage, inside he was still trying to figure out who he was when there were no lights, no music, no one applauding. There were nights when the cheers still echoed in his ears, but when the door closed, everything disappeared, leaving only an emptiness he could not name, a feeling that was not exactly sadness, nor loneliness in the usual way, but a deep silence that made him not know what to fill it with. He stepped onto the stage and became someone else, a version everyone loved. But when he came back, he had to face a person even he had not truly understood yet, as if life had demanded he grow up on stage before he had time to grow up in his own real life. Success, in the eyes of others, was the peak, the destination, something everyone wanted to achieve. But for him it came as something too big, too fast, leaving no space for him to breathe, to think, to fully feel what was happening. He learned how to smile at the right moment, say the right thing, move to the right rhythm, become the image people expected. But every time he did that, some part inside him became more unfamiliar, as if he was slowly turning into a person the world recognized, but he himself did not. And the most painful thing was not that he was misunderstood, but that he never had enough time to truly understand himself before the whole world decided who he was. The roles, the interviews, the camera flashes, all created a perfect story of success. But no one asked how he felt when everything happened too fast, when things that should have come step by step instead rushed in all at once, when he had to carry the image of an icon, while inside he was still just a person trying to keep his balance, after losses he had not even had time to name. And perhaps, right in those years, between the height of fame and the depth of emptiness, a gap was formed. The gap between the person the world saw and the person he felt. A gap not easy to notice from the outside, but large enough to make him, even standing among millions of people, still feel like he was standing alone, in a space where the lights illuminated everything except what was really happening inside him. And then, just as quickly as the lights had found him, they began to fade. Not dramatically, not with any specific moment that could be pointed to as the change, but little by little, roles that no longer created buzz, invitations becoming fewer, phone calls growing quieter, until John Travolta realized something was leaving his life that he could not hold back. After the peak of Saturday Night Fever and Grease in 2020, the world once believed he would be there forever, that the light would never go out. But Hollywood, like everything else in his life, promised nothing permanent, and the decisions he made in the years after that, whether from belief or confusion, gradually pulled him away from the position he once held. There were roles he turned down, opportunities he did not recognize the value of at the time, and also projects he joined but brought nothing except silence. A different kind of silence, but this time not the quiet between rounds of applause, but the complete absence of them. The phone that once rang non-stop now became quiet. The invitations that once came pouring in now no longer appeared, and for the first time in many years, he had to face a question he had avoided for so long. If there were no more lights, no more roles, no more people calling his name, then who was he? There was no immediate answer, no dramatic moment of realization, only a long, heavy feeling, as if he was slowly drifting out of a world where he had once been the center. The people who were once around him, the eyes that once turned to him, the praises that once repeated, all gradually disappeared, not because of any clear mistake, but simply because attention had shifted elsewhere, to new faces, new stories, new dreams that he was no longer part of. And the pain did not lie in being criticized or failing publicly, but in no longer being mentioned, no longer being waited for, no longer being needed. He was no longer the center of the story, but had become a memory, a name people once knew, once loved, but no longer sought. There were days that passed with no filming schedule, no meetings, nothing to prepare for, and in those days, he had to face a space he had never been familiar with before. A life without roles, without characters, without a script to hold on to. And in that silence, the questions began to grow, not about his career, but about himself, about his value when no longer seen, about whether everything he had once been truly existed or was only part of the lights that had gone out. He could continue to appear, continue to work, continue to try to hold on to what was left, but there was one thing he could not avoid, the feeling that he was slowly becoming a stranger to his own life. There were no more peaks to climb, no clear goals to head toward. Only a long emptiness remained, where time moved slower, heavier, and each day brought a clearer realization that what had passed might never come back. And perhaps, in those years, the hardest thing was not losing fame, but learning how to exist without it, learning how to live in a world that no longer revolved around him, learning how to accept that the lights could go out without any reason, and when they did, there would be no one there to tell him everything would be okay. Because this time, as the light faded, there really was no one left, only him, alone, with the long silence that had no end. And then, in the period when everything seemed to have slowed down, when the lights were no longer as bright as before, and the silence had become a familiar part of life, John Travolta met Kelly Preston. Not like an explosive moment or a sudden change, but like something that came gently, enough for him to realize that life, even though it had taken so much, had not completely closed its door. Kelly did not come to replace anyone, did not bring grand promises or unrealistic expectations, but simply was there, present, listening, and standing beside a man who had begun to get used to facing everything by himself. And that very simplicity, in a way, became what made him feel safer than anything he had ever experienced. There was no longer the rush of youth, no longer the explosive emotions he once knew. This time, love carried a different color, quieter, deeper, and also more fragile, as if both understood that what they were building was not just a relationship, but a place to return to in a world that was no longer certain. They built a home, little by little, without noise, without show, with a small belief that this time things might be different, that life might give them a chance to keep something longer, that perhaps after all the losses there was still room for a lasting peace. But that belief, though it existed, was never truly solid, because deep inside he still carried the memory of that first loss, the memory of things that had come and then left without him being able to stop them. And that very memory kept him from ever fully letting go of the fear. There were moments when everything seemed perfect: a quiet evening, a family meal, a look that needed no explanation, but even in those moments there still existed a very light feeling, very hard to name, like a shadow passing by, reminding him that the best things usually do not stay forever. He loved, but loved more carefully, keeping a part of himself, not because he did not trust, but because he understood too well the feeling of loss. Kelly, in her own way, gradually became his anchor, not through grand words, but through patience, through the way she stayed even when he was silent, through the way she did not demand he explain what he could not yet say. And in that presence, he began to learn how to trust again. Not completely, but enough to keep moving forward. The days passed, and for the first time in a long time, he felt he was no longer completely alone, that there was someone there to share not only the joys, but also the silences he once had to face by himself. But even as life gradually stabilized, even as the home slowly became a clear reality, the obsession with loss still did not leave. It was no longer loud like before, no longer present in every thought, but it was still there, quietly, like a part of who he was, like a reminder that anything he had could disappear at any time. And perhaps what made this love different was not that it had no fear, but that both still chose to stay despite that fear, still chose to build, to trust, to love, even knowing nothing was certain. To outsiders, it might be a story about starting over, about finding happiness after losses. But for him, it was also a journey of learning how to live with what could not be changed. Learning how to love without forgetting that loss is part of life. Learning how to hold on to the present without trying to control the future. And in that fragile balance between hope and worry, between peace and fear, he continued to move forward. Not because he had overcome everything, but because for the first time in a long time he had a reason not to stop. Even though deep inside he always knew that what he had, no matter how precious, would never completely belong to him forever. And then, when life seemed to have settled down long enough for him to breathe, when John Travolta began to get used to a rhythm of life no longer completely dominated by the lights, another opportunity appeared, not loudly, not certain, but enough to change the direction of everything. When he accepted the role in Pulp Fiction under the direction of Quentin Tarantino, a film that at the time was not an obvious choice. Not a safe path, but like a step into the uncertain. A chance that, if successful, could bring him back, and if it failed, could make him disappear completely from the place he once belonged. And when the film was released, everything changed almost immediately. His name was mentioned again, not as a memory, but as a presence, a person who was still there, who could still capture the audience's attention, who could still become the center of the story. Hollywood, which had once turned its back, now opened its doors once more. Invitations returned, phone calls appeared, opportunities that had disappeared before gradually came back, as if time had reversed, as if everything that had been lost could be reclaimed. But what no one really saw was that this time, he no longer felt everything the way he once did. Success came back, but the emotions did not. The applause still sounded, but it no longer brought the same feeling. The lights still shone, but they no longer made him feel like he belonged to them the way he once did. Because between those two moments, Between the first time he stood at the peak and the second time he was brought back, too much had happened. Too many losses had accumulated, too many silences had reshaped the way he saw everything. He stepped into interviews, premieres, events that he once considered the center of his life. But this time, he stood there with a different feeling, as if he was watching himself from the outside, as if he was participating in a story where he was no longer completely the main character. There were moments when he smiled, answered, appeared the right way, but deep inside there still existed a distance he could not close, a separation between the person the world saw and the person he felt, and that did not come from tiredness or boredom, but from a clear realization that fame, no matter how many times it returned, could not touch what had been lost. The old wounds did not disappear when he came back. They were not replaced by new roles or praises, but remained there, quietly, unchanged, as a part of who he was that no lights could illuminate or soothe. He may have regained his place in the public eye. He may have become a name mentioned again, but inside, something had changed permanently. He no longer sought validation from those things, no longer believed that success could fill the gaps life had left behind. And perhaps that was what made this comeback different, not because it was bigger or more important, but because it no longer carried the illusion that everything would become whole. He worked, continued to appear, continued to act, but no longer with the feeling that it was the only place he existed, no longer with the belief that the lights could define who he was. And in that change there was a light sadness, not clear, but enough to make him realize that there were things that once broken would never return to their original shape, no matter how many times you rebuilt them. Fame could return, opportunities could appear, but peace, something he had never truly had, still remained out of reach. Like something he could see, could feel, but could not touch. And so, the second time, standing under the lights, he was no longer the man of the first time, no longer the person who believed he could hold on to everything, but a person who had understood that there were things that could not be fixed, and even if life gave him another chance, it would never return what had been lost. And then, after all the times of rising and falling, after the moments when fame returned but no longer brought a feeling of completeness, John Travolta began to shift the focus of his life, no longer toward the lights or the roles, but toward something quieter, closer, and also more fragile: family. The place where, for the first time, he felt he did not need to become anyone other than himself. When he became a father, everything changed. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but like a slow shift, where the things that once mattered gradually moved to the background, and the small, ordinary things became more meaningful than anything he had ever pursued. He no longer woke up to think about the next role, but to think about the children in his house, about familiar voices, about small footsteps running through the hallway, about mornings when light came through the window and everything seemed peaceful in a way he had never known before. Above all, Jett, his first son, became the center of that world, not because he was perfect, but because he needed him more, needed the presence, the care, the patience that he was willing to give everything to protect. With Jett, love was not something abstract, but every small action, every time being there, every moment he tried to understand and accept, even when it was not always easy, even on tiring days, long sleepless nights, worries that could not be put into words. But it was in those things that he found a meaning fame had never brought, a feeling that this time he did not just exist, but was truly present, truly important to someone, not because of what he performed, but because he was there. Family gradually became the only place where he felt everything could stop, where he did not need to prove anything, did not need to perform, did not need to keep up an image, where silence was no longer frightening but became part of the peace. There were simple evenings with no cameras, no lights, only talking voices, laughter, stories that were not important, but made him feel complete in a way he had never experienced before. And in those moments, a belief began to form, very light, very fragile, but enough for him to hold on to, that this time everything would be different, that life might have taken enough already, that perhaps this time he would not have to lose anyone else. That belief did not come from certainty, but from desire, from the need to keep the only thing that made him feel he had a place to belong. He began to build his life around family, choosing his time, choosing work, choosing the way he lived, all revolving around the people he did not want to lose. But even when everything seemed to be in the right place, when the days passed in that rare stability, there was still a part inside him that was not completely at ease, a part that still remembered, that still carried what had happened before, as a reminder that nothing was permanent, that what he had, no matter how precious, could still disappear. And perhaps that was exactly what made him cherish every moment more, hold on tighter, love more, as if he was trying to make up for something he could not name, as if every day that passed carried a greater meaning because he knew, in a way, that the most peaceful things were often the most fragile. And in that space, between quiet mornings and simple evenings, between the laughter of his children and the silent presence of his wife beside him, he continued to live, not as a star, but as a father, a husband, a person who had found a reason to stay, to hold on, to believe that this time life would not repeat what had happened before, even though deep inside he always knew there was no guarantee it would not happen again. But right in those years, when everything seemed to have found a steady rhythm, when John Travolta began to believe he could keep what mattered most, another reality gradually emerged, not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly and heavily, tied to the son he loved most, Jett, the child who from a very young age had not entered life as easily as other children. When the first signs of his health condition began to appear, at first vague and hard to understand, then gradually becoming clearer, more complicated, and finally undeniable. Jett was not simply a child who needed to be loved, but a child who needed to be protected in a special way, who needed constant care, who needed attention that could not always be predicted. The seizures came unexpectedly, without any pattern, could happen in the most ordinary moments, turning seemingly stable days into breathless moments of tension. There were nights when he could not sleep, not because of work, not because of pressure, but because of the constant worry that anything could happen, that just one moment of carelessness could lead to what he feared most. And in those moments he was no longer a star, no longer a man standing in front of millions of viewers, but only a father, trying to keep his child's world from collapsing, even though he knew there were things beyond his control. The days of caring for Jett did not have a clear straight line, did not have a destination he could head toward, but were only a continuous series of efforts, adaptations, decisions he had to make without enough answers, without any guarantee that he was doing the right thing. There were times when Jett was stable, days when everything seemed easier to breathe, and those very moments made him hope, made him believe that perhaps everything would be okay, that perhaps what he feared would not happen. But then the seizures returned. The unexplained signs appeared again, and each time like that, the fear not only came back but grew stronger, deeper, as if every time he faced it he was pulled closer to something he did not want to think about. He tried to control everything within his power, from the living environment, daily routines, to every small detail in Jett's life, as if being careful enough, attentive enough, present enough could prevent the worst from happening. But over time, a truth gradually became clearer, not through any specific moment, but through an accumulated feeling that there were things he could not control, that there were things that did not depend on how much he loved his son or how hard he tried. And it was that realization that made him feel the most powerless, because it stood completely against the instinct of a father, the instinct to protect, to fix, to hold on. There were moments when he could only stand there, watch, wait, hope that everything would pass, without being able to do anything to speed up or change its course. And in those moments, memories of previous losses began to return, no longer distant, no longer faint, but clearly present. as a reminder that life had once taken away what he loved and might do it again. The fear he once thought he had overcome, once thought he had learned to live with, now returned in a different form, stronger, more personal, because this time it was not just a memory but a possibility present in every day. And even though he continued, still cared, still stayed there, still tried to keep everything within reach, deep inside he began to understand that he could not control the outcome, that all he could do was be present, love, stay by his side, even if that did not guarantee everything would be okay. And perhaps that was what made this journey heavier than anything he had ever experienced. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it dragged on, because it repeated, because every day carried a possibility he could not remove, and every night ended with the same question he never had an answer, for whether tomorrow would still be like today, or whether that would be the day he had to face what he had feared for so long. And then, what John Travolta had tried not to think about throughout those long years, what he had quietly fought against with all the presence, care, and love of a father, finally still happened. Not like a storm arriving with clear signs, but like an ordinary moment being cut short, a day that began like any other, and then suddenly became an unforgettable memory. The Bahamas, 29, a place that should have been a space for rest, for family, for those rare times when everything could slow down, became the point where everything stopped in a way no one could prepare for. There was no clear warning, no arrangement so he could be ready, only a chain of events that unfolded faster than anyone's ability to understand, so that in one moment the world he had tried to protect for so many years suddenly became unfamiliar. There were sounds, there were movements, there were actions taking place, but then everything was replaced by something else. A silence so deep it could not be described, not the quiet of an ordinary evening, but the complete absence of everything that once had meaning. He was there, no longer as an actor, no longer as a man who was used to controlling his image, but only as a father standing before a reality that could not be changed, could not be negotiated, could not be postponed. There were moments when the mind tried to understand what was happening, tried to find an explanation, a reason, something to hold on to. But nothing appeared. No answer was enough to make it make sense because there were losses that did not follow any logic a person could understand. There was no way to go back before that. No moment he could change to create a different outcome. No choice he could make to prevent it from happening. And it was that very impossibility to change, that finality, that made everything heavier, because it left no space at all for hope, allowed no possibility that things could be different. Jett was no longer there, and that truth did not come in steps, but all at once, complete, impossible to break down, impossible to soften. There were people around, there were words, there were actions being taken, but all of them became distant, as if he was standing outside that very moment, watching it happen without being able to truly touch it. And in that separation, one thing became clearer than anything he had ever known, that there were moments that not only changed your life, but also changed the way you existed in it. After that, time continued to pass, as it always did, but no longer in the old way, no longer carrying the same meaning. The days after that had no clear shape, no beginning or end he could identify, only a chain of moments following one another in a space where everything seemed to have lost its weight. There were things that had to be done, decisions that had to be made, people who had to be met. But all of it happened as if in a fog, where he still moved, still reacted, but was not really present in the way he once was. And in all of that, what remained clearest was not what had happened, but the emptiness it left behind. An emptiness with no specific shape, no measurable size, but large enough to cover everything around it. No words could fill it, no actions could make it disappear. No time could erase the truth that a part of his life had stopped right there, at the moment he could not change. And perhaps what made that day different was not the event itself, but the way it cut off everything before it. The way it made everything he once knew about family, about love, about the ability to protect, more fragile than ever. He was still there, still breathing, still living, but no longer the person from the day before, no longer carrying the same feeling about the world, because once you have stood before a loss like that, everything afterward carries a different color, a different weight, a different silence. And in that silence there were no answers, no conclusions, no way to close it, only one single truth, that there were gaps that would never be filled, and there were days that would never truly end, even though time continued to move on. And after the day when everything stopped in a way that could not be reversed, John Travolta's life did not end, but it also never returned to what it was before. With no clear line marking the transition, no moment when he could say he had stepped through, only a quiet but complete change where familiar things gradually took on a different meaning. Heavier, slower, and harder to name. The days continued to pass, as they always did, but no longer carried the normal feeling he once knew. Each morning was no longer a clear beginning. Each evening was no longer an ending, but only segments following one another in a flow of time whose rhythm he no longer controlled. He still woke up, still moved, still talked, still did the things a person needed to do to keep existing, but inside, some part had stopped, a part that no longer moved forward, no longer changed, no longer searched, but just stayed there, holding on to the moment he could not forget. Some people say time will ease the pain, that eventually everything will become lighter, that humans have the ability to heal, but for him, the pain did not disappear. It did not leave, it was not replaced, but only changed shape, became less loud, less sharp, but spread wider, seeping into every thought, every action, every silence he could not avoid. There were times when he smiled, talked, appeared in public, and from the outside everything might look normal. But inside, there still existed another layer of emotion, a layer no one could see, where every moment carried the memory of what had been lost. He no longer reacted to the world in the old way, no longer looked at things with the same lightness, because once you have gone through a loss like that, you cannot return to the previous state, cannot become the person you once were, no matter how hard you try. He continued to work, continued to appear, continued to live in a world that had long been used to his image. But now, everything carried a distance, a separation he could not erase. There were moments when he stood in the middle of a crowd, among eyes, among familiar sounds, but felt he was somewhere else, as if part of him no longer belonged to that space. And in the moments when he was alone, when no one was around, when there was nothing left to do except exist, the pain became clearer, not like a big wave, but like a continuous flow that did not stop, did not disappear, only changed speed. He learned how to live with it, not by fully accepting it, but by no longer trying to fight against it, because there were things that could not be fixed, could not be reversed, could not be redone. He learned to let it stay there, as a part of himself, as something he carried, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. There were easier days, there were heavier days, but there was no day completely without it, no day when he could forget it, even for a moment. And perhaps what made this journey the hardest was not that he had to continue living, but that he had to do so while carrying a part of the past he could not put down, could not leave behind. He did not collapse, did not disappear, did not stop, but he also did not return, did not recover in the way people usually think, because there were losses that did not allow you to go back, only allowed you to continue in a different form, with a different way of existing. And in that continuation there was a silence, not complete emptiness, but a space where everything was kept, where memories were not erased, where love did not disappear, and also where the pain did not leave, only changed, only settled, but always stayed there as an inseparable part of the person he had become. And then, While the pain remained there as an inseparable part, John Travolta gradually realized that life, even though it had taken away so much, still had things that could not be abandoned. People who were still there, still looking toward him, still needing him in a way no one else could replace. And it was in that realization that the role of a father was no longer just a part of life, but became the center of everything. He could no longer live only with memories, could no longer let himself sink completely into what had been lost, because beside him there were still the children, the sons and daughters who still needed his presence, needed stability, needed a support that he knew if he could not hold, everything might continue to collapse. He began to focus on what was left, not as a way to forget, but as a way to continue, to keep life from falling completely into the emptiness the loss had left behind. The small moments, the things that before might have passed unnoticed, now became clearer, more meaningful, as if every day carried a value he no longer took for granted. A meal together, a short conversation, a look that needed no explanation, all of them became things he tried to hold on to, not because they were grand, but because they were what remained of a life he did not want to lose any more of. There were times when silence still appeared, the quiet spaces he could not avoid, but now he no longer faced them alone. But in that space there was still the presence of those who remained, the people he knew he had to be there for. He was no longer the man who lived only for himself, no longer the person searching for meaning in work or fame, but a father trying to keep a family from falling apart, trying to create a sense of stability while inside himself there were still gaps that could not be filled. There were days when that became harder, when the pain returned more clearly, when memories grew stronger, when the feeling of loss could not be pushed away. But even on those days, he still stayed, still continued, not because he had overcome it, but because he understood that there were people who depended on him not collapsing. He learned how to share, not everything, but enough so that his children did not feel left behind in a space they did not understand. He learned how to listen, not only with words, but with presence, with being there when needed, even when there was nothing to say. Family, at this point, was no longer a perfect place, no longer an ideal image, but a real space where there was both pain and effort, where everyone existed together, faced together what had happened, each in their own way. And in that space, he tried to keep everything from falling apart further. Not by controlling, but by not leaving, by staying no matter how difficult it was. He might not be able to repair what had happened, might not be able to bring back what had been lost, but he could hold on to what remained, could make sure that the people beside him did not have to go through it alone. And perhaps it was right in those years, when everything was no longer defined by success or failure, but by presence and responsibility, that he found another way to continue, not as a complete healing, but as a choice, a decision repeated every day that no matter how much life took away, he would still stay, would still hold on to those who remained, not because he was not in pain, but because he loved, and because that love, even carrying fear, was still enough to make him keep moving forward in a world that had changed permanently. And then, when John Travolta had just learned how to stand steady for those who remained, when he began to get used to carrying the pain while still continuing to live, life, in a quiet but no less cruel way, took away one more thing he once believed he could keep. When Kelly Preston, the woman who had been by his side through the hardest years, began to face an illness that both of them chose to keep private, not because they did not want to share, but because there were battles people were forced to face in silence, day by day, moment by moment, without any preparation ever being truly enough. The illness did not come as a complete surprise, but the way it progressed, the way it quietly crept into their lives, made everything gradually change in ways no one could stop. The days no longer felt like before. No longer the peaceful moments he had tried to preserve, but became periods measured by waiting, by fragile hope that everything might slow down, might stop, Even though deep in his heart he understood that there were things that could not be reversed, he was there, as he had once been, for the people he loved before. Not as a star or someone who could change fate, but only as a man trying to hold on to the most important person in his life, even knowing he had no power to decide the outcome. The final days were not loud, not dramatic, not filled with the big moments people usually imagine, but only a long silence, where every second that passed carried a meaning no one wanted to face, where every look, every gesture, every quiet moment became deeper, heavier, as if both knew time was running out, but neither said it. There were things that needed no words, emotions that could not be expressed, and in that space he could only stay, continue to be present, continue to love, even knowing it was not enough to keep what was slowly leaving. And then, 2020, when the final moment came, it did not bring release, did not bring answers, but only left another emptiness, deeper, wider, heavier than anything he had experienced before. Kelly was no longer there, and that truth, like the times before, could not be softened, could not be changed, could not be understood in any logical way, because loss, when it came multiple times, did not become easier to accept, but only became familiar in a more painful way. This time there was no one left standing beside him to share the silence, no one who understood him without him having to explain, no one who could look at him and see everything he did not say. He did not just lose a wife, but lost a companion, the person who had seen him at his weakest moments, who had been there when everything fell apart and helped him stand up, who had become a part of the way he existed in this world. And when she left, a part of him left with her, not in a clear way, not in a way others could see, but enough to make everything afterward different, emptier, quieter. There were losses you could share, pains you could speak about, but there were also gaps for which no words were enough to describe, and this time that was exactly what he had to face. He was still there, still continued, still present for those who remained, but there was no longer the same support as before, no longer a place to return to when things became too heavy, no longer anyone to hold the memories with that. Only the two of them understood. And perhaps what made this loss the deepest was not only that he lost a person, but that he lost the only place where he could be himself without having to try. Lost the only person who could see him not as a symbol, but as a human being. And from then on, his world, even though there were still people around, even though there were still reasons to continue, had lost something irreplaceable. Something no time could bring back, a gap he could not fill, only carry, in silence, as he had done before, but this time with a clearer understanding than ever that there were losses, when they happened too many times, that were no longer separate moments, but had become a part of who you are, shaping the way you exist in the remaining world. And after everything that had happened, after the irreversible losses and the gaps that could not be filled, John Travolta's life gradually stepped into a different rhythm, no longer rushed, no longer loud, no longer pulled by the lights or expectations from the outside, but became slower, quieter, as if everything finally stopped so he could fully feel what remained. There were no more big premieres, no more events he had to appear at, no more nights when applause rang out as a familiar part of life, only days passing in a space where the loudest sounds were sometimes just footsteps, the wind, or memories that suddenly returned without warning. Mornings arrived in a different way, no longer tied to a schedule, no longer divided by work, but opened in stillness, where he could sit there longer, think more, and feel more clearly the things he previously had no time to face. There were moments when he looked out the window, not searching for anything specific, not waiting for anything to happen, just simply being there, existing, in a world that had changed in a way he could not reverse. He lived with memories, not as a choice, but as a natural part of life, where images, voices, and moments from the past still appeared, not to hurt him in the old way, but to remind him of everything that had once existed. There were days when memories came gently, like a light breeze passing through, but there were also days when they felt heavier, clearer, making him stop, breathe more slowly, as if time in those moments stretched longer than usual. And in all of it, loneliness did not need to be named, did not need to be explained, because it did not come from having no one around, but from the fact that the most important people were no longer there in the way they once had been. He still had family, still had people who loved him, still had reasons to continue, but there were gaps no one else could touch. Gaps tied to specific people, specific relationships, memories that only he fully understood. There was no way to fill them, no way to replace them, only to live with them, to accept that they would be there. Not disappearing, not changing, but also not completely swallowing him. And perhaps what made this period different was not the silence itself, but the way he existed in that silence, no longer trying to fight against it, no longer trying to fill it with other things, but letting it exist as a part of life he could not separate from. He was no longer the man chasing the lights, no longer the person trying to keep everything under control, but had become someone who slowed down, settled, observed more, spoke less, and felt deeper what remained. There were evenings that passed with no memorable events, nothing special happening, but it was precisely in those moments that he found a different form of existence, not happiness in the traditional way, but an acceptance, a quiet that was no longer as frightening as before, even though it still carried an inseparable sadness. And in that quiet, there were no conclusions, no clear answers, only a person still there, still living, still continuing, not because everything was okay, but because he had learned how to exist in a world where nothing was the same as before, a world where silence was no longer an emptiness that needed to be filled, but had become the only space where he could truly be himself, with everything that had been lost and everything that still remained. And when everything finally settled, when the sounds of a life that had once been brilliant gradually dissolved into the long silence, John Travolta no longer stood in the position the world was used to seeing him, no longer at the center of the lights, no longer at the peak of praise, but in a different place, with no audience, no roles, only a person looking back at his own life, not to retell it, not to explain it, but to understand it in the way only those who have gone through enough can do. When looking back at that entire journey, there was no clear straight line, no perfect story that could be wrapped in a few simple words, no complete ending in the way stories are usually told, because his life was not built from continuous victories, but from repeated losses, from times of standing up not because he was ready, but because there was no other choice. He had once had everything a person could wish for: fame, recognition, love, family, and then, over time, each part of it was taken away, not all at once, not according to any logic he could understand, but little by little, enough for him to feel it, enough for him to remember, enough for him to never forget. The wounds did not disappear with the years, did not fade in the way people still hope, but only changed, becoming less sharp, but spreading wider, seeping into the way he saw the world, the way he loved, the way he existed. Some people believe humans can overcome everything, that there is a point after which everything becomes lighter, that time can heal, but for him, the truth was not in overcoming, but in continuing, not with a new person, but with everything that had happened still there, not erased, not replaced. He had never truly overcome it completely. There was no moment when he could say he had left it all behind, no day when he woke up and realized the pain had disappeared, because there were things that, once they became part of you, would never leave, only change the way they existed. And perhaps what made his story different was not what he had achieved, but the way he carried what had been lost while still continuing to move forward, not like a victory, but like a persistent existence. He continued to live, not because life became easier, not because he had found answers for everything that had happened, but because there were still people who needed him, still eyes looking toward him not as a symbol but as a father, a person who was still there. The remaining children became the reason, not the only reason, but a reason enough for him not to stop. Enough for him to wake up each day, enough for him to keep life going, even though inside there were still gaps that could not be filled. He no longer searched for perfection, no longer tried to build a story more beautiful than reality, but accepted that his life, like himself, carried both light and darkness, both love and loss, both what once was and what was no longer. And in that acceptance there was a different kind of peace, not the absence of pain, but the ability to exist with it without letting it completely destroy who he was. From the outside, he might still be the familiar image, still the name people remembered when talking about a certain era. But inside, he was a different person, a person who had gone through enough to understand that not everything could be kept, that there were things you had to let go of, even when you did not want to, and there were things you had to carry even when you did not choose them. And when the story closed, not with a clear ending, not with a spoken message, but with an image, a man still standing there, no longer needing to prove anything, no longer needing to be seen in the old way, just simply existing. In the silence he had learned to live with, carrying everything that had once belonged to him, and everything that had once belonged to him, and everything that had left, as an inseparable part of the person he had become. Looking back at John Travolta's entire journey, what makes people not only feel admiration but also truly heartbroken is the contrast between the spotlight and what he had to silently endure behind it. From a cultural icon with Saturday Night Fever and Grease, he once stood where millions of Americans dreamed of being. But the story did not stop at that success, and gradually shifted to a series of deeply personal losses. The death of Diana Hyland laid the foundation for the fear of losing loved ones. The collapse of his career in the 1980s forced him to face being forgotten. And then, the greatest tragedy, the loss of his son Jett in a moment that could not be reversed, followed by the passing of Kelly Preston. After a quiet battle with illness had made his life no longer a story about fame, but a long journey of endurance. What is worth noting is that in all those details he was not saved in the way audiences usually expect. He never truly overcame it completely, but only learned how to keep living, keep being a father, keep being present even though inside he had changed permanently. And that is exactly what creates the greatest value from this story for American society. In a culture that often celebrates victory, recovery, and happy endings, his life reminds us that not everyone gets a complete ending, but people can still live with kindness, responsibility, and dignity, even while carrying unhealable pain. The lesson is not in becoming stronger than others, but in not giving up on those who remain, just like the way he continued to stay for his family after all the losses. And that is the most honorable image, not a star, but a human being who chose to keep living when every reason to collapse had appeared. If this story touches you, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to pay tribute to a man who has lost so much, but still chose to stay for the people he loved. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video where we will continue to look deeper into the lives behind the spotlight.